In 2014, Christopher Tolkien published his father's translation of Beowulf, accompanied by commentary on the poem that Professor Tolkien presumably gave to his students while teaching. The translation, being written in 1926 when Tolkien was only 34 and still had the majority of his Beowulf scholarship ahead of him, is pretty shaky. The commentary, however, was written much later, during his 2 decades as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, at the height of his academic prowess. It's interesting to find, then, that one of his first comments is completely at odds with essentially every Beowulf translation ever written. He is primarily concerned with the Old English kenning hronrade in line 10a, which usually gets translated, to his chagrin, as whale road. Why did Tolkien disagree with this so much? Why has nobody followed his advice? And who, at the end of the day, is right? Stay tuned. This is the opening to Beowulf in Tom Shippey's recent translation, which is, in my opinion, the best. I'll have the link to that in the description if you're interested. Here is our word, hronrade, right there in the 10th line of one of the most famous poems ever composed. Shippey's translation philosophy is usually to give general translations for these poetic compounds, which is probably most accurate for how the native listener and the poet would have understood them. For the literal meaning, we can consult 2 dictionaries from Tolkien's time, the Bosworth-Toller Dictionary of Oxford and the Clark Hall Dictionary of Cambridge. Both dictionaries give whale road from the 2 constituents, hron and rad. Now, in his commentary, Tolkien has an extended note on this word, which begins simply by explaining the Old English usage of the poetic compound, but devolves into something of a rant on common translations. Here's what he has to say. It is quite incorrect to translate it, as it is all too frequently translated, whale road. It is incorrect stylistically, since compounds of this sort sound in themselves clumsy or bizarre in modern English, even when their components are correctly selected. In this particular instance, the unfortunate sound association with railroad increases the ineptitude. It is incorrect in fact. Rad is the ancestor of our modern word road, but it does not mean road. Etymology is not a safe guide to sense. Rad is the noun of action to ridan, ride, and means riding, i.e. riding on horseback, moving as a horse does, or a chariot, or as a ship does at anchor. And hence a journey on horseback, or more seldom by ship. A course, however vagrant. It does not mean the actual track, still less the hard, paved, permanent, and more or less straight tracks that we associate with the road. Also, hron is a word peculiar to Old English. It means some kind of a whale, that is, of the family of fish-like mammals. What precisely is not known, but it was something of the porpoise or dolphin kind, probably. At any rate, less than a real whale. There is a statement in Old English that a hron was about 7 times the size of a seal, and a whale about 7 times the size of a hron. The word as kenning, therefore, means dolphins riding, i.e., in full, the watery fields where you can see dolphins and lesser members of the whale tribe playing, or seeming to gallop, like a line of riders on the plains. That is the picture and comparison the kenning was meant to evoke. It is not evoked by whale road, which suggests a sort of semi-submarine steam engine running along submerged metal rails over the Atlantic. So that's what Tolkien thought. Who agrees with him? Well, the first ever translation of Beowulf, written in Latin in 1815 by Crimir Torkelin, gives Catorum Vias, that is, the roads of the whales, so not Torkelin. We can see from Tolkien's frustrations and the 2 dictionaries that this was a normal translation in his time. So what about afterwards? 4 years after Tolkien dies, Howell Chickering publishes a translation and gives whale road, so not Chickering. In 2000, Seamus Heaney's famous translation gets published and again gives whale road, so not Heaney. I actually realized as I was making this video that right next to me on my desk are 2 really important editions of Beowulf that I can just show you. This is Kleber's Beowulf 4th edition, otherwise known as the Kleber 4. probably the most important thing ever written on Beowulf. It is the current definitive scholarly edition. Even 15 years after its publication, it still holds up. And if we go to the glossary in the back on page 400 and find the word hronrade, we get whale road. Now, much of the work on the Kleber 4 was done by the scholar R.D. Fulk, who, this is no exaggeration, might be one of the greatest scholars of all time, really a titan of academia. And he has his own translation, written about 2 years later. And if we go to the first page of that translation, page 87 of this book, we get Whale Road. Now, this is all before 2014, when Tolkien's commentary is published. Surely later translations reflect the new reading? Nope! In 2020, Maria Headley actually quotes Tolkien's commentary multiple times and gives Whale Road. And the regularly updated online Toronto Dictionary of Old English gives, you guessed it, Whale Road. So who agrees with Tolkien? Basically no one. But is he wrong? Let's look at the evidence. At least concerning the word rad, Tolkien is factually correct. The word just doesn't mean road, and most dictionaries will actually agree with him on this until it gets put into a compound, and that's probably just because it's easier to say the Swan Road than the riding place of the swan, regardless of the fact that the latter is more accurate. Even Tom Shippey, arguably one of the greatest philologists and Tolkien scholars of all time, uses the word road in his translation, just for the sake of brevity. The trickier constituent is hron. No one agrees with Tolkien on hron. The dictionaries all say whale, the translations all say whale, the editions all say whale. At first glance, Tolkien seems to be a little crazy with this complaint. And you know what? I actually think he's right about this too. One thing I want to point out before I get into the meaning of hron, if you'll actually check out the translation Tolkien wrote himself, you'll find the word whale used in this position. That's because this translation was written in 1926. He was still only 34 years old. The commentary was written several decades later. So it's not that he's like betraying himself. It's more so that he didn't realize yet what the word meant. Now, a huge problem pops out at us when we try to translate hron as whale in modern English. And that is the same thing that Tolkien said. We have a sentence in Old English that refers to hwalas as being 7 times hronas. What does 7 times mean? We'll get into that in a second. It took me a very long time to find what Tolkien was talking about, though. Eventually I did. Let's do some manuscript reading together. This is Vatican Palatinus Latinus 68. It is a commentary on Psalm 73 in the Vulgate counting. And here it says about the Leviathan, et dicunt quod septem minoribus saturantur maiores. That is, and they say that 7 of the smaller ones, the greater ones are satiated or sort of filled. And then it explains that in Old English, here, sivu, fiskas, selas, fyllu. This is early Northumbrian, so we get some strange forms like sivu instead of 7. But here it says 7 fish sort of fill a seal is what I'll translate this as. Now, fill here could mean fill as in food, as in a seal eats 7 fish. That's pretty plausible. It also could theoretically mean that the physical shape of a seal is filled with 7 fish. That is, a seal is 7 times bigger than a fish. That's also plausible. I tend to lean towards the former interpretation, but really either of them for our purposes works. Here it continues. Sivu selas hronas fyllu. That is, 7 seals fill a hron. Now, this tells us that a hron is at least larger than a seal, either in the sense that it could eat 7 seals or that it could be filled physically by 7 seals. So, sounds like something around the size of a large dolphin. Sivu hronas hwalas fyllu. 7 hrons fill a whale. Again, placing it somewhere around the size of a large dolphin. Either way, how could you say that a hron is a whale if here we have a sentence saying, let's translate it as whale, that 7 whales fill a whale? It just doesn't make sense. translating hron as whale is really difficult, at least in this context. If you look at every instance of the word hron, it clearly refers to an aquatic animal of some kind, but never a large one. Trust me, I actually did look at every single occurrence of this word hron. And if you want to as well, you can read this paper I wrote on it last year. Be warned, it's pretty boring. The main takeaway is, however, exactly as Tolkien said. When speakers of Old English wanted to talk about what we would call a whale in modern English, they used the word whale. When they wanted to talk about something more the size of a large dolphin, they used the word hron. And here we run into a problem with modern English. We call this animal a false killer whale, but the average person watching from the beach would probably see this animal and call it a large dolphin. They wouldn't be totally wrong either, because the false killer whale is actually classified as a delphinid, but they probably wouldn't know that the vernacular name is whale unless they were educated in marine biology, because when you say the word whale, the median English speaker thinks of something that looks like this, not this. But we can demonstrate pretty well that the Old English word hron meant something like this, a big dolphin. Now, how should we translate it? If you had to pick one word to describe this animal, do you think whale or dolphin is more accurate? You can let me know in the comments if you disagree, but I personally side with Tolkien on this one. I think the word hronrade meant the riding of the dolphins and the playground of mysterious legendary creatures. Thanks a lot for watching. If you like this content, check out the rest of the channel, kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon, and until next time, Farath Ye Yesunde.